Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a special guest with us. Her name is Lucille Barkman. She's a life transitions mentor who supports women navigating significant changes in their lives. With compassion, clarity, and lived experience, she helps women find strength, direction, and a renewed sense of purpose and self through the seasons of uncertainty and transformation. And Lucille's here today to share her story about how she tragically lost her daughter in a car accident when she was just 22 years old. And so she's got a very powerful story about her grief journey as well as her healing journey from that. And I'm looking forward to her sharing her story with us today on the podcast. So without further ado, Lucille, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise, and I'm really excited to have this episode because when you and I connected back in August, your story about your daughter Brittany was very, very powerful and in many ways resonated with me and some other guests that I've had on the podcast. But share with us a little bit about that car accident.
All right. I'm still hesitant to share because as we talked about when we first had our pre-recording interview, my story feels a little bit different than most, a little less feeling and emotional. But anyways, I am going to just talk about it and see how it goes. So it'll be 6 years on November 1st that she was killed in a car accident. I was at work. Um, my coworkers and I were all standing in the office chatting before we had to go back to work, and got a phone call from my daughter's office, and I just assumed she was calling me from her place of work. But when I answered the phone, it was her boss, and he said there's been something. Brittany's been in an accident, and basically she didn't make it. And I said, fuck. And I hung up and I looked at my coworkers and I said, my daughter's dead. And one of them got me a chair, another one says, go get her some water. And within minutes, my manager says, come on, I'll take you over to where the accident is, because it was just like 5 minutes from my work. So we headed over there, and of course the road's blocked off, and so we talked to the police that was in charge there, and she took my information. Normally speaking, I don't know that the parent shows up at the scene of the accident. So, but in my case, I am glad. I mean, I didn't actually see the accident. We were too far away, with the road was blocked off, but I talked to the cops, then they got my information. And then we headed to pick up my oldest daughter. She was working at the local restaurant. And so I called ahead, talked to her manager, and says, I'm coming in. Brittany's been killed. Don't tell Violet. I'm gonna be there shortly to pick her up. So I did that. I went in and I picked her up, and the people around were standing around. A few people that knew were standing around there supporting her and me, as I told her. And then we left. And then I went to my youngest daughter's place of work, called there, and was going to talk to a manager also to just tell them that I was coming. But it ended up that she got put on the phone, and so I actually told her over the phone. But as news travels fast, people already knew. When I told her, there were people there that already knew about the accident. So there were people that could support her for the 5 minutes it took me to get there yet. And then we went home. The police are there, they come over to talk to you, and different organizations that come and support you for the trauma, help you offer their services for the trauma. And by this was at, what did it happen, at 12:30ish? By 4 o'clock-ish, I already had, my manager had found funeral homes we could use, churches that we could have the funeral in. I had friends showing up, with food, and I'll just stop a minute to say this. I've come from conservative Mennonite background, so this is normal to have this kind of a networking where people show up with food and support you and have all the and it sort all these things out for you. So that's normal for the world that I grew up in. And so yeah, that there were people coming and going and I just kind of sat there, you know. When I get in a stressful situation, I tend to be the organizer and the planner. That's how I handle stressful situations. I don't cry a lot, and maybe I will also add here, I've been someone who's been emotionally shut down all my life. Um, so I didn't feel a lot all my life, anger or sadness. And so in this situation, looking back 6 years, I felt it, but I didn't like it wasn't an overwhelming. I was actually scared of it being such an overwhelmingly horrible feeling that maybe I blocked it. I don't know because I have never actually felt that horrible, awful, overwhelming feeling. And part of me is just very glad because I don't know if I could handle it because it would feel so awful.
I,
And so,
I'm very appreciative for you sharing that with us today on the podcast, and it's why I'm looking forward to having this discussion today because I try to show people that grief doesn't always come in that very overly emotional box we all see all the time, or when we
mhm,
watch TV shows or we listen to podcasts for that matter, and watch everybody, cry uncontrollably, scream and yell, and there's always this outward burst of emotion.
mhm,
There are people out there just like you that don't respond that way to those situations. They respond the opposite way. And there's people out there that say, like, oh, there's something wrong with that. Well, no, there's not, because society has shown us that this is how we're supposed to do things. But again,
mhm,
not everybody grieves the same way. Not everybody processes things the same way. And as you described about coming from that Mennonite background of community gathers around us in these moments, it's normal for this to happen for us. Maybe those of us who aren't in the Mennonite community don't necessarily have those resources come right available to us, and we've got a different experience. So I just
yeah,
wanted to interrupt you really quickly to say that
mhm,
I honor who you are, and there's nothing wrong with the way you grieved, and there's nothing wrong with the way you responded in that moment. You responded the way you needed to, which is the
yeah.
most important. Yeah. So, I wanted to ask you, in that moment, did you have any kind of racing thoughts, or did your mind go blank? Because the reason I ask is that my grandparents got in a nasty car accident, ended up in the hospital, and I was able to go to the scene of that accident, and I didn't have an emotional response very well either. My mind was in like complete shock and blank out of how do I take care of this? How do we get to the hospital? How do we talk to doctors? How do we deal with the car? My brain was so much in that figuring things out that I skipped over that emotional part of, what could really happen. Tell me a little bit more about how you felt in that moment as you were getting all that support from the Mennonite community, and on top of that, reeling with the reality that your daughter was no longer here.
I mean, like I said, I kind of just sat on the chair and, listened to the people as they came around me. But, and but I think the biggest thing, I know this sounds really odd, but I've been a single mom. By then, I'd been a single mom for at least 15 years. So, I had to navigate singleness and raising daughters all on my own. And so when this happened, as awful as it was, there was something that I enjoyed. And that was that for that whole week, from the time she was killed till, a week later when the funeral service was over, there were people around me. I did not have to worry about cooking. I did not have to worry about this or about that or about the next thing. I could just be, and people took care of me. That was the best feeling there was. I could, in the mornings, we didn't, because of my smaller house, we didn't have people there, so it was just my daughter and I for a bit, and then my brother came and spent time with us. So in the mornings, I would get up. There's nobody around. Everybody that was there was sleeping. I would get up, I would walk, which is hugely important. I walk when I'm stressed, then walking, being out in nature is very important to me. And I come home, relax, and do my thing. And then by lunchtime, people would start showing up. My family would show up and different things. And, my ex-husband came, and that went as well as can be expected. We at least were getting along finally for that week. We could plan things. We could organize, figure out how we were going to do this all. So that also was good because we don't normally speak. And so that was good. And anybody that knew my daughter Brittany very well knew that she wanted to be cremated. She didn't she didn't want to, die and be put in the cold dark ground. She wanted to be cremated. And this was, anybody that knew her very well knew that. And so it wasn't a question for us, at least my girls and I, that this is what we would do. And my ex-husband was reasonably okay with it. But then we ran into complications because his family, I am conservative Mennonite, but his family is horse and buggy Mennonite, which is much, much more conservative. And cremation is just not an option for them. Because there is a verse in the Bible, I should have looked it up, but there's a verse in the Bible, something about that the heathens cremate their dead. There's a verse like that. And so, they hold to that literally. So that was, aside from what he was trying to say. And it came to the point where I had to say to him, my girls were standing there. I says, if, you're going to need to make a choice. Either you support your parents, what they want, and have that kind of a burial without cremation. But then your girls are going to basically disown you because you didn't respect your daughter's wishes. Or
How,
you do it, you support us and we go through with the cremation, then your family's going to be unhappy about it. So he was in a really tough place. And I really felt sorry for him because, how do you juggle two differences like that?
that's got to be a very tricky situation to go through with the belief systems behind that, because
Yeah,
it's almost like you pick option A and the other side's not going to be happy. Pick
yeah,
option B, this side's not going to be happy. And I love that you respected your daughter's wishes at that point. I mean, I think that from my perspective, my beliefs, I just think that's a real nice way to honor her passing.
yeah. No, that wasn't ever a question. It was just a matter of actually, at least never a question on our part, but it was, navigating and interestingly, because of the accident, I don't know how this all works, but they told us through the week before the funeral that they didn't even know if the body was going to make it back in time because it gets shipped to Toronto for an autopsy, I guess. And and so for whatever reason, they didn't know if it would be back. So we actually ended up having a memorial service versus a funeral. So I actually don't even know whether my daughter was there at the service. I didn't ask. And so, yeah.
Uh, so they had to perform an autopsy, even though it was really evident how she passed. And that's just is
I
that part of
guess,
the
yeah.
is that part of how they do that in Canada where you're from?
I guess the only one I've ever experienced. So
Gotcha. Well, tell me a little bit about, you went through this memorial service and, I know you said you haven't had a lot of heavy emotions like normal people have had, but were there moments that came up after the memorial service where that tried to creep out in a little way, or did you get any kind of glimmers of that as you started to your healing journey?
Now, like, what did I say? It's 6 years, almost 6 years. I have those, it's never far from your mind. And so I feel more now than I did then. It's a bit odd, but that's how it is. And, you know, I got rid of a lot of her stuff right away because we knew we were going to be moving. And right now, I'm very glad that I did that because the stuff I kept now, some of it's, it was clothes, they're getting old. So you have to finally you just have to get rid of some stuff. And now it's way harder for me to let go of actual tangible things of her, you
Yeah,
know, and it pops up every now and then. It's like, the tears well up a bit. When it does pop up, it often seems to be at night, and it's just like, nope, we are not going to. When it's bedtime, that's my happy time to relax. We're not going to go down the road of grief and sadness before I go to sleep.
so tell me a little bit about, when you were growing up, did you go through any losses of family members or people around you? And, what was it like to grieve growing up? Because I think I remember you saying in your family, grief didn't have much space held, if I remember right.
Well, I think part of that, I think my dad was also very much like I am, was emotionally, from what I understand of his trauma and his past. I think he chose to shut down because, his grandfather was quite hard on him, or his father, I mean. So there's a bit of a generational thing about that. But when it comes to actually close loss in my family, I did not experience my first grandmother passed away, a grandfather, but I didn't go to the funeral. They lived in Manitoba. So my first grandparent funeral I would have gone to, I was married and had all my kids by then. So as a younger person, I had gone to very few funerals even. And
Well,
so I really hadn't experienced much.
What I love about your story about, I know you said it's kind of like emotionally shut down, but we all learn how to grieve from our family. We all learn how to grieve from those closest to us because they give us the example or give us the mindset or idea of how to grieve. And
Mm.
what I try to tell people about grief too is that whether you're a very emotional person as you go through grief or you're emotionally shut down during grief, it may not sometimes be really how you feel in the moment, but it's what you've been taught and what you've been shown. And when we don't know any other than that, it's hard for us to assimilate newer ways to grieve, or when those emotions come up, we just don't know what to do with them. And we don't really know how to identify with it. And in a lot of ways, it can feel uncomfortable. Me personally, there's people that can get overly, in my opinion, overly emotional from my perspective of grief, where I just can't relate to it. And it doesn't mean that they're grieving wrong or there's some, they're being overly emotional. It doesn't mean that. It just means I can't really assimilate with it because I didn't have that experience. And
Yeah,
so what I try to share with people about grief is just because you didn't have the experience and it might look weird to you or feel weird for whatever reason, what you're seeing is an emotion coming towards you that you just haven't had space for in your life yet or experienced. And so treating it from an observation standpoint of something you can learn from or some new perspective you can look at can be really helpful in your own experience of grief and maybe can help you, grieve in a different way than maybe you're used to.
yeah. I remember this isn't about someone losing someone, but I remember at a family gathering on my dad's side. My dad is quite emotionally shut down, like he does, or stoic. He doesn't cry very easily. But his sisters, on the other hand, the rest of his family, they could cry. Like it would be almost over the top sometimes. And I remember at this family gathering, my dad's brother-in-law asked him to kind of, at family gatherings, you have memories and you talk about this and that and the people and the family. And so dad was supposed to be in charge of this to just, keep it from getting away with it, getting away on them. And at that same gathering, my cousin and I, we were probably, I don't know, early teens maybe. We decided we were not going to cry, which I find interesting now that I think about it. Clearly, I would have cried at those things because her and I chose not to, actually. We were not going to cry at this because everybody else was. So
That is interesting.
that is interesting now that I say that.
Yeah. And was that because you guys wanted to, you wanted to grieve in a way that your father showed you, or was that just that you saw that opposite reaction with everybody else and wanted to, maybe it sounds like you're trying to find your own way to grieve, is what that sounded
Yeah,
like.
maybe, but I find it interesting now that I think about it. I mean, I know that my mom grieves much differently than my dad, and I have an aversion to people with in tears, I think. It's just
Well,
like, you know, I don't want to hug you. I don't want to.
yeah, well, some people are like that. And I think when you're around very stoic people, that stoicism, really shows you to emotionally separate yourself in a lot of ways from that experience. And uh, my grandfather, in many ways, he was a tough Norwegian, and so
Uh-huh.
uh, my grandfather never really showed a lot of emotions. He never really did. Kind of a flat kind of face with things. But what was really interesting about his stoicness is that you could see it in his eyes and you could see it underneath things
Mhm.
with things he would say or certain memories he'd pull up. You would see it come out just in a different way. So I don't always think that if somebody's emotionally stoic in a lot of ways, I don't think that they're not feeling things or they're not
Yeah,
experiencing things because they are experiencing grief. It's just in a very quiet, very subdued way that most of us won't pick up on. Because, like I said, society has trained us in so many ways to have a big outpour of cry or grieve this
yeah,
direction here to try to conform us in one style of grief. But grief is very individualistic depending on your background and who you were raised by. And as you described, your mom was more emotional than your dad was. Your dad was very stoic. Mom showed emotion a lot more. And when you gravitate towards one or the other growing up, as you're trying to develop your own beliefs and your own way of grieving, you might gravitate one way or the other. And it won't be until you run into those situations in life on your own that you start to question those beliefs of why I feel the way I do, or maybe why I grieve the way I do.
yeah. And I also think, thinking of my past, generations before, I think part of that, this stoicism comes from, or the not, or being emotionally shut down comes from the survival. Literally, there was so much actually loss, like parents passing away in in the 4 or 5 generations before me, that the kid, like when a parent dies and the children are left to be on their own, you can't just cry your life away. You literally have to pick up the pieces because there's seemingly nobody else around you to help you, so you've got to buckle down and survive. And I think that plays a big role in there too. And even for myself, you know, the emotional disconnect that I had growing up with my parents because they couldn't emotionally support me, that is the reason I shut down. Because if you can't receive emotional support from a parent, how are you going to survive without shutting down?
That's an interesting point that you bring up. Did you have to seek that emotional support from friends or people in the community growing up? And if your parents
Well,
weren't
I
able to
mean,
hold space?
looking back, I've only realized this in the last years that that's what was going on. For me, I lived my straight line, and if I connected with friends, if I did, and if I didn't, well, then I didn't, so it was, yeah, it was a very flat line. Like, I will sometimes ask my friends that I grew up with, you know, did I, like, how did I actually, was I even excited when I got married? Or like when we were doing this or that, what was I experiencing? Because I don't remember how I felt then.
That's, that is so fascinating to me, Lucille. I, I've talked to so many people that I can recall those things so quickly, and it actually, I'm really excited to talk to you, by the way, because you've got that opposite experience that we don't always talk about in life. And the thing that I was happy you brought up now, because I had a podcast guest who traveled to Africa and did humanitarian work, talk about grief. And I've never been to Africa, but what he told me about his mission trips is he said, people die over there all the time, every day, over sickness and disease. They just don't have modern medicine like we do in the States. And so, what I found interesting when he was talking about grief, which is what you said a few minutes ago, is that they had to be stoic and move on because they have to go hunt for food. They have to find
Yeah,
water every day. They've got to survive. And when you're in survival, you can't sit there and grieve as much as you want to, like we can in the States. We can spend months and years grieving in the States because we can go to the store real easy. We've got access to medicine really easy. We've got community, we've got social media. But like in the bush of Africa, for example, you don't have those things. And so survival is dependent upon you pulling yourself together and understanding that today is borderline live or die. It's you've got to go survive, and then
yeah.
after you've done that, that's when you can have time to grieve. So, uh,
And when I did counseling, one of the things my counselor told me, she says, we are in a time now where we have time to grieve, to deal with the things of the past, to grieve the things of the past, because up until, not that many years ago, they were pioneering, they were trying to make a go of things in a new country, and they didn't have time to think about the losses and how they felt about them. But we are now in a time of life where we have this opportunity to take the time to deal with our past and our grieve our losses and that kind of thing.
well, I think that's what's interesting about society today, but I think it's a part of ourselves that needs to heal because I do find that a lot of people in the grief community that either don't hold space for themselves or don't know how to work through those emotions, it always comes out in some other way, whether that's
Yeah.
an angry outburst or, turning to alcohol, for example, to deal with those things. And so I do think it's important to spend time with your emotions and understanding how you feel about something. Uh, I wanted to ask you, since it's been 6 years now, have you noticed any changes in yourself as you've gone through your healing process? And have there been any revelations about that stoicism approach to emotion and grief? Have you found yourself softening in certain ways? Have you found yourself experiencing emotions that may have always been there, but just never really had the space for it? What have been some big takeaways that you've had along your healing journey?
Well, I definitely, when I think about my daughter, I have more feeling about the loss of it and the sadness that goes with it. So, as I think as time moves on, my whole emotional being is shifting. Even the anger that I feel, it's just like out of nowhere, I will just get furious. And finally, I'm realizing that because the thing I'm mad about, the thing that made me mad, has nothing to do with me, what I'm actually feeling. I think it's literally, it's because I've healed enough and it's safe enough. Now these emotions that are all inside of me have, because they've always been there, they they are starting to come up. And I'm feeling more sad. I'm feeling more angry. Oh my gosh, the anger is Because I never, for one thing, it's wrong to be angry, but you need to be angry because anger tells you something. So yeah, it's kind of like this now. And I don't really like this. You have good days and then you don't have such good days. Life goes up and down. I prefer I prefer the straight line where you weren't going, good, not good, and good, not good. But they tell me that's part of life. That's probably more realistic than the straight line thing.
Well, that's a misconception in grief all the time that I try to help people with is grief doesn't look like this. It's very up and very down,
Yeah.
and it's giving yourself permission to ride the roller coaster, as I like to call it. You brought up anger, and I share with people I've had a lot of anger over my life. I have, and I think that going through grief made it more intense in certain ways. But I try to tell people when I coach them and they get angry and they apologize for it. I always say, I don't want you to apologize for your anger because what it's trying to do is communicate something to you. And it's
Mhm.
oftentimes an emotion that's been really suppressed or really buried that's coming to the surface really hot. Um, and when we try to, have society tell us that anger is a bad thing, it's terrible, we shouldn't feel angry. I don't really buy that in a lot of ways because it's telling people to suppress themselves versus
Yeah.
expressing. And I always like to share that if you give anger some space and let yourself be angry, let yourself understand what's trying to be there, that anger will actually come down very quickly because
Yeah,
you're
and I'm
listening to
I'm I'm
yourself.
learning that, okay, let's just feel what's going on here, and then pretty either you get an answer for what you're feeling, or things just kind of drop down. But back to the grief thing, one of the things that, well, I don't feel it a lot, or like show it a lot, but I sometimes think the fear of me losing somebody else, of having another, like I say, nobody is allowed to die in my family till I die. Aside from my parents, nobody else is allowed to die because I'm the oldest. So
Hmm.
I need to die first, and I plan to live a long life. So nobody's dying. Nobody's, these phone calls that, because we just had a cousin that was killed recently, and my brother called me. When my brother calls me, he doesn't usually call me. So when he calls me, something's not right. And sure enough, he's calling to say that, I thought it was maybe mom and dad because he lives next door to mom and dad, but no, it was our cousin that was killed in a tragic accident. And so, we start to, I have a brother lives on the West Coast. So I message him, when you wake up, can you call me? So when he wakes up, he calls me, he says, who died? Like that's our response. That's our family's response now, since we've experienced such trauma. And I don't know if that's a good way, but that is because, if certain things are off, then it's like, what happened? What's wrong? Who died?
I couldn't agree more with you on that because when you do go through a big tragedy like the way you lost your daughter, even the way I lost my son, like you can't help but sit there when you have this like inkling in the back of your head. I've never been able to figure out how to explain it, but when you get those calls, like you said, it's always just like, okay, what happened here? Like something
Yeah,
big went on. This wasn't just a hi, how are you conversation. Um,
yeah.
so
So yeah, it is, and after my daughter died, it was like I began to realize that death is part of life. Like we can't avoid it. I don't know if we can do anything. I don't like the fact that I have this, like even as I talk about it, I have this thing in the bottom pit of my stomach that feels a little fear. Like, what if something happens to somebody that I care about? And I don't know. I would just like it not to be there, but that isn't even realistic.
that's an emotion you're feeling. It's trying to tell you something.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah,
And I think that's my style of, I think that's my, for now, that's my style of feeling grief is the fear of it happening again.
And I think that it's going to happen again. That's the hard part,
Well, that,
that we
yeah,
all,
you
like
know,
you said, I'm with you. I wish it wouldn't happen, but it's going to. And
yeah,
that's where, I've always told people there's two things in life we have no control over, which is we don't get to choose when we're born or how we're born, and we don't get to choose when we die. We don't.
yeah,
And so, uh, we can always live in fear of those things, which I think a lot of people do, is they fear death for whatever reason, and that's a lot of reasons why. Is just, again, we've been trained by society with how many TV shows and
yeah,
how we don't really talk about things. I talked about, when I lost my grandfather, I showed people the funeral people come by the house, they pick up the body, whoosh, it's gone. The next time you even hear or see anything, it's either an urn for ashes or a casket in the ground. And that's it. That's all you know about it. And
yeah,
so there's a big shroud of mystery, there's a big shroud of uncertainty, there's a big shroud of unknown. And also on top of that, we don't talk about it. And then on top of that one, we don't teach people how to grieve. We don't teach people how to feel emotions. We don't teach people how to process what happened or even explain to them why or how, in a lot of ways. And so death is something that we all fear for those reasons, because,
yeah,
again, when you shroud it in a mystery of things, the fear level goes up and it becomes, I'm not ready for this. I don't understand this. I don't know
yeah,
why this has to happen. Um, and so I do think there's space in society today to talk more about this and help people understand what this really means, what this is really like. When you said too that you had a memorial service and you're not even sure if your daughter was there, you're not even, they took the body in a whole different city for an autopsy.
hmm.
Again, they put so much mystery there, you didn't even know really what was going on. And that's an unfortunate side of grief in that situation.
One thing I do know, so her accident, she was hit from behind, flipped into the oncoming traffic, hit again, ended up in her boss's front yard, the whole thing up in flames. So one thing I do know, the coroner called me and said she was dead before the fire started. So that to me is very comforting, because when they did the autopsy, they looked, there was no smoke in her throat. So she was gone before the fire started. And it could have been so much worse had she not been gone.
Um,
I think
I'm
they
I'm
couldn't
ha-
put the fire out, like she would have burnt.
I'm happy to hear that in a lot of ways, because that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because
I talked to
there are situations where people are alive and and burn. And that is so awful for them and for the people that are standing by, that are helpless. They can't do anything because the fire's too great, or
I think that's one of the hardest parts of going through loss, is that we have a compelled sense in our human nature to do something and help someone. It's really innate in us. And a lot of times in situations like you explained about your daughter, there is nothing you can do. And that thing in grief, I've been in that situation multiple times, and it's the hardest feeling of grief, because your innate human being wants to do something, but you literally can't change the circumstance. You can't
yeah.
help. You can't do anything, and that feeling of helplessness, I think, creates a big chasm in grief and emotion for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And because this is my story, I am grateful that it happened so fast, because it was like ripping the band-aid off. It was good and then it wasn't. Whereas because this is my personal story, that makes sense to me. When I look at someone whose child is in the hospital and what they all need to go through as they watch their child not being able to be well, that must be tremendous.
Yeah, it's hard for people to go through those moments, and it's a
Knowing
big,
that
yeah.
they
Sorry,
can't
go.
do nothing.
Yeah, that's the hardest part of these grief situations that I talk about on my podcast, is you sometimes there's moments you can't do anything, and it's
Yeah.
really life taking its course. And that's, we talk about that a lot with animals, but when it comes to us, we get very, there's got to be something we can do. And the example you brought up with children in the hospital, you know, a parent is always going to have that thing in themselves with the
Yeah,
child of, can I do, there's got to be something I can do. There's got to be a different way, a different outcome, a different means. Uh, and then there's times that there's not. And I think what's hard about that, as a lost parent, is that we end up living life in reverse because of that. One of my things when I lost my son, I kept saying a lot the first month after I lost him is, I'm supposed to die before him, and
hmm,
that didn't happen, and that was hard for me to wrap my head around because
yeah,
our life is not meant to be that way. We're supposed to die before our children.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so that's a really, really hard one for a lot of parents to go through. And I think those of us who lose a child like you and I, it's something I say that is in many ways a life sentence because we can't ever get rid of it or get over it or move on from it. We
Yeah,
can't. It just isn't going to happen. Um, and so it's about finding that way through it and finding that way forward. Um, which is leading me to my next question I want to ask you. Have you found ways to honor and celebrate your daughter's legacy and her life up to today?
um, ideally what me and my family, my daughters would like to do is because my daughter Brittany wanted to change the world. She was in school for psychology and she wanted to make a difference. And so um last year my youngest daughter created a fundraiser in honor of her and gave to the local charity, which was very nice. How we could do that on a big scale, I don't know yet. It would be nice. I mean, we take off. So she was killed on November 1st, which is Day of the Dead, All Saints Day, National Day of.
Um,
We in North America don't celebrate it as much as some of the other countries do. So I had a friend the year after, I had a friend that asked if I wanted to, get together and do something like that, have a little celebration, invite different people who had lost somebody, and we could all bring pictures of our loved ones and, just be together. And that it was such a great idea. I don't know why we don't celebrate it in Canada or the US, because
yeah,
it's one day out of the year that we can talk about our loved ones, because after they pass away, you don't talk about them because what's there to talk about? Their life stopped. But one day out of the year, you can talk about them. We usually take my daughter and I, we usually take that day off work if it's a work day. And, we've been taking it off. We go to the grave, we have lunch together and just that kind of thing. And I've started celebrating, this year I took their birthday off. Her birthday's in August. And so I took that day off also because it was, why not celebrate these things?
see, I really like that you did that because not enough people, do that in my opinion. And I love that you brought up, the Day of the Dead. I know Mexico celebrates that a lot. I've heard about
Yeah.
that a lot growing up. And just because their life stops doesn't mean that we can't stop honoring their memory and carrying their legacy
And
forward with
that's, I
us.
think, the hardest part for me is like after a certain time, you can't really talk about them because their life has stopped. So, when you talk about your kids, well, they're doing this and they're doing that and they're going on with their life. But when you have a child who's died, you can only talk about memories. And, the stranger on the street that you're sitting beside in the train when you're traveling, if you get into a conversation, they don't particularly want to hear about your child who's died. They're more interested in your children that are, you know, if you're having a conversation with them, and you just don't talk about your child that's died.
Well, I think that's what, I've tried to raise awareness of is in the lost parent community is that just because our children pass doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them. And I
Yeah.
think that's something that I definitely ran into a lot after losing my son. It was just like, okay, it happened. It's in the past. And I learned very quickly for me, that's not the case. And I learned in the lost parent community, that's definitely not the case. And so we all have a unique experience. We have a unique way of life when we lose a child. And it's going to be very, very unfamiliar and uncommon for the rest of society to accept it or understand it or hold space for us for that matter.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where, I have learned that when you lose a child, it is a very different thing than losing a parent or losing a grandparent or losing a pet. It's a
Yeah.
very different thing. And I do believe it makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. But at the same time, again, it's our experience of life, and that's truly what matters is our experience, not what everybody else thinks. And so being able to teach people how to hold space for those of us like you and I that have
Yeah.
lost a child, I wish more people would get over the uncomfortableness of that and understand that just because it's uncomfortable for you doesn't mean it didn't exist or didn't happen. And so there's actually more for us to help serve lost parents by holding space for them to talk about the
Yeah.
memories of their child.
Because usually, if I'm in a situation where I'm introducing myself and we're talking about our lives, how many kids you had, or if somebody asks you how many kids you have, I usually always say three because I did, you know, and often I may say something about, my middle daughter passed away. I guess that's me just putting it out there because she was my child. I'm not just going to forget about her.
I
Just
think that's a
because I
bit,
have two living children and that's what we're talking about. She's there too.
yeah, I think that's just a beautiful way to still carry forward that legacy of your
Yeah,
daughter. And that's something I talk about too in the lost parent community. And it's a great place for us as we wrap up the podcast to share that just because they're not with us here doesn't mean they never existed. It doesn't mean they were
yeah,
never
well,
alive.
exactly, yeah.
So,
And
well,
she had a dog. Brittany had a dog. I got her a dog. And so I took care of it after she died. And I had to put her down this past January. And that was the most horrible thing I had to do. Because my youngest daughter, she says, I can't come with you. I can't. So you're gonna have to do it on your own. And she had health issues. She was still, chipper and fine. She was 14, and I had to go and put her down. And that was traumatic because I was putting the last thing of the last living thing of my daughter. I had to choose to put it down because she was old, she wasn't well. And yeah, that was quite awful to have to actually go and do that.
I,
And we had her cremated too, so we could spread her ashes. And so yeah, it's a lot of things that just flow together of losses and different situations. And the interesting thing was that the vet assistant that put her down, her name was Brittany, same as my daughter's.
oh, that's ironic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Man,
So there are little things that spark joy. Just the fact of knowing that, my dog was going to be taken care of by another Brittany. Those are little moments where you latch on to and that bring you joy in the memories as you look back. And
I appreciate you sharing that story with us as we wrap up here because that's a part of life that's very hard. It was your daughter's dog, and then having
yeah,
to put the dog down. It's almost like another wave of grief coming, and then at
yeah,
the same time, it's not just bringing closure to that moment, but it's also giving you a new beginning because of that. And
yeah,
I also I love that the vet tech's name was Brittany too. That's just there's always these synchronicities that happen in grief, and
yeah,
I can't help but chuckle sometimes because I feel like God or a higher power, if you want to call it that, is looking over in that moment and giving you a small
yeah.
piece of comfort as you navigate that part of life. So, well, Lucille, I just want to say thank you so much for being a guest today on the podcast and sharing the story about your daughter Brittany, as well as her dog, and just sharing your grief journey with us because I do talk to a lot of people who are very emotionally open and out there with their emotions, as we oftentimes see in grief, but very rarely do I get to talk to somebody who's more stoic with their emotions and to get that perspective of
Mhm.
grief. And I do think there's more people out there like you than you want to think about. And today's episode gave those people the courage enough to know that you are just as important in the grief process. You experience things just like everybody else does, and there's nothing wrong with the way you grieve. So I just wanted to say thank you for having the courage to just be you and share that it's okay to be emotionally stoic.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And as I usually wrap up my podcast, I generally ask two questions of my guests. One of them is if you run into somebody who's going through grief currently or feels stuck in grief, what's one thing you would share with them that might help them navigate that journey just a little easier?
That is a great question. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how to answer it because depending on the situation and who they are, you can say, I'm sorry. I don't know. Is silence okay? Even just your presence.
I think that's beautiful, by the way. I I've tried to share with a lot of people in grief. Sometimes the best thing you can do is show up with your presence and just be there for somebody. You don't have to fix them or talk constantly or tell them it's going to be okay or tell them you've gone through something similar. You don't even have to do any of those things, but
Yeah.
simply saying I'm sorry and holding presence for them to allow them space to grieve, I think is the most beautiful thing you can give. I love your advice and your answer to that question. Um, and Lucille, if people wanted to connect with you after this podcast, is there a way they could reach out to you, either social media or do you have a website?
So I'm on social media on Instagram and Facebook under Lucille Dawn Barkman. And my website is lucilledawnbarkman.com. And so they
Perfect.
can connect with me there, either place.
Perfect. Well, for listeners today, I will have Lucille's social media and her website link in the show notes. So when you get done with this episode listening, check on the show notes there. You can find ways to reach out and connect with her. Lucille, again, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Well, thank you so much also.
And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Lucille and I today on this episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Lucille's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you, visit empoweredgriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. The Power Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you can navigate journey or grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.